Okay.
All right, welcome everybody to another fantabulous webinar. This evening we're hearing from Teresa, Wolcott, and Deleo from the USDA Asian Longhorned Beetle Cooperative Eradication Program. Say that 10 times fast. And they are going to talk us through tree identification and all the glory of all the trees that you can find. We're very glad you could be here tonight. I am going to you can definitely type questions in the chat or the question and answer. There's multiple opportunities. And if you are comfortable with being allowed to talk, I can unmute you at any point. I think you have the option of putting up your little blue hand in your participants window so that I know to do that for you. Or say in the chat that you want to be able to talk, and we'll let you do that, okay? And I am going to make myself go away now and turn it over to Teresa and Eric.
Yeah. So, hello everybody. Can you all see our? Can everybody see the slideshow?
I can see it, Teresa.
Excellent. So I'm Teresa Wolcott. I'm a PPQ, Plant Protection and Quarantine Technician that works for the USDA. And Eric is also, my colleague Eric is here. And we can share more about our backgrounds maybe at the end. We have so much material to cover. We can talk a little bit about the program and what we do at the end, but we just wanted to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and on this slide, just because we do have a lot of material, this is our contact information. So you can contact us by email with questions. So please feel free to do that, not just tonight. We probably won't be able to access our email from here, but as you're going through the tree ID process, you can definitely contact us with questions. We'd love to hear from you. And I'm just going to do a quick overview of our topics today. We're going to, why would you want to learn tree ID is our first question. And as we go through the presentation, we're going to cover some important vocabulary terms. And we're going to focus a lot on tree identification. And in particular, we're going to go through some facts and vocabulary, but we're also going to use a dichotomous tree key. I think most of you have, or some of you have, for your guidebook, a book called Peterson's Field Guide to Eastern Trees. So I have that one. Eric actually has a similar book. It's the Peterson's Guide to Eastern Trees and Shrubs. So we're sort of going to, we've outlined this program so it follows some of the categories that are in that dichotomous key. And of course, we have an extensive list of trees. We're going to go through some key identifying characteristics, and there are all the trees on your list, the trees that you're supposed to know for your projects. So first of all, why tree ID? And this is a really important part of it. It's just good to know what's around if there are toxic plants. So this is an actual tree, poison sumac. You really have to go into swamps and swampy areas to find it. And this is not actually a tree, it's a woody vine. Poison ivy, and you may have heard people say leaves the three, let it be. This is everywhere. It's a native plant. It's important bird food, but it's really annoying to people who are allergic to it in the field. So you want your trips in the woods to be pleasant, and I'm going to recommend that you get out your books and learn how to identify these two trees at first, even though they're not on your list of trees. And the other reason why for me, like if you're in the woods, if you're just looking at this picture, it's beautiful and it's green and it's trees, but as you get to know more about trees, they sort of become old friends, like they'll pop out of the background, and it really changes your walk in the woods. And also identification helps you to look closely at organisms, and you just can't help but learn more about them. And it's nice to see old friends as you're walking through the woods as well. And since we just talked about a woody vine versus a tree, I just wanted to provide you with a definition of what is a tree. And so, of course, went immediately to the USDA, except this time to the Forest Service. And you can see it's a very Well, it's kind of a vague definition, really. But in general, you know, they're at least 50 feet tall, 3 inches, 4.5 feet from the ground or at breast height. And the major parts are the crown, the trunk, and the roots. And the internal portion of the tree is also important. You may see something like this when you come for your, to do some of the Envirothon activities. This is what we call a tree cookie, just because it looks like a cookie, but it's a cross section cut through the tree. I like this particular diagram because it shows the difference between the two, the heartwood, which is this darker part in the center that gives support to the tree, and the sapwood, which is part of the vascular system of the tree, which is lighter in color. And that's pretty much true for all trees. And this is just a diagram that has a little bit more detail. So most of the living tissue is right here. The living tissue is formed on one side is the xylem and phloem. So xylem transports water from the roots to the top of the tree, and the phloem will transport nutrients throughout the tree as well. And now I'm going to turn it over to Eric because he's going to talk a little bit about how we are sure what tree we're talking about when we're scientists.
Hello, my name's Eric. So I'm going to start off talking about the binomial system. So you guys might know trees by their common names like a sugar maple or a red maple, but they actually have a scientific name behind that, which is called a binomial name, which means it has 2 names. And this is to make it more specific to the species rather than having some common names that might get confused with other ones. So it starts off with a genus and a species. So the genus is more of related organisms, and then the species is the specific organism that you're trying to name. This was popularized by Carl van Leeuwen, who is a Swedish botanist, and he's considered the father of modern taxonomy. So we might get some lag time with some of these slides. So benefits of the binomial system, like I was saying, it differentiates among related organisms. For instance, big cats. The genus of them is Panthera, but then you have their specific names. So Panthera leo is a lion, a Panthera concolor is a mountain lion, Panthera tigris is a tiger. So it just makes it a little bit more specific rather than just calling them like a big cat. So in the tree world, next slide comes. Yeah. So in the tree world, it differentiates among organisms the same way. So with maples, the genus name is Acer, and then you have followed by the species name. So red maple would be Acer rubrum, sugar maple Acer saccharum, and Norway maple Acer plantainoides. These are all related trees. You wouldn't just call them a maple, and then you would call them by their specific name. But to eliminate like the confusion of common names, people can call something a robin in Europe, but it could be a completely different species in America. The robin in America is Turdus migratorus, but the robin in Europe is Erathicus rebiculea, and they're completely different looking organisms. So the binomial system and Latin names are supposed to eliminate that confusion. Another way that common names get confused is that they differ regionally or among different industries, but they still are the same species. But common names can differ depending on the wood's properties, how it's used, the tree's actual characteristics, or even its location. So for instance, the sugar maple, Acer saccharum, is called a rock maple or a hard maple in the woodworking industry because the wood has a hard characteristic. Or a red maple, Acer rubrum, is sometimes called a swamp maple because it's often found in swamps. Or a striped maple is sometimes called the goosefoot maple because the leaves resemble a goose's foot. And one more, black birch, Betula lenta, is also called the sweet birch because a lot of the time it's the most common used birch to produce birch beer, which is a popular drink. And then there's just a few other examples of how common names can be changed based on different characteristics. So some clues to tree ID are, we're going to start out with softwoods and conifers. Hardwoods are deciduous trees that lose their leaves in the fall. And then other clues to tree ID are the leaf types and the patterns. And what we mean by that are needle-like or scale-like leaves, broadleaf leaves, which are deciduous trees that lose their leaves. And within those broadleaf leaves, we have other categories such as opposite or alternate or whorled trees or branch patterns. But then further into these clues of tree ID, you want to look closer at their twigs, their buds, their flowered seeds and fruit, their tree bark, the shapes of the tree, and their tree locations. So these all could help you with identifying a tree in the field. There we go.
Okay, so like Eric said in the overview, we're looking at the first division in our dichotomous key is softwoods. They are the conifers, and they can have needle or scale-like leaves. So in the summer, they look the same as they do in the winter. But the hardwoods or broadleaf trees are what we call deciduous. And what that means is that in the summer, they grow, in the spring, they grow fresh leaves, they drop them in the fall, and they're dormant in the winter. And so the next step, after we've determined whether it's a deciduous tree or a softwood, is to look at the leaves. And this is a really key step in tree ID, and it's how the Peterson's Guide is organized. And we look at leaf shapes, the location along the stem, which can be opposite or alternate or whorled. Leaves can be, they can be simple or compound. And the veination in leaves, the pattern of the veins in the leaves can help you ID the tree. The margins or edges of the leaves have important textures and clues. And the tips and bases can also be important areas to look at to determine what the identification of a tree is. So the leaf types, again, this is blown up, but if you can see my cursor, this is a scale-like leaf, and these are needles. And this maple leaf is an example of a broadleaf tree. So they're broad and flat, and they do look very different from each other. So the first leaf type, again, I'm just going to review what these are once more. The conifers or softwoods are mostly evergreen, which means they stay green all winter. But even more importantly, they spread their seeds with cones instead of flowers. And all of the broadleaf trees have flowers that are, some are pollinated by wind, some by insects. And certain broadleaf trees like the American holly and some magnolias, well, they're still broadleaf trees, but they will have green leaves over the winter, and they do not have cones. And so our next step is going to be to count the numbers of needles and bunches or other characteristics specific to this type of tree. So then if you're doing the process of elimination using the dichotomous key, if you don't have the needle or scale-like trees, these are some examples of broadleaf trees. And they, and again, they drop their leaves, they use flowers to spread their seeds. And the next step for these is often looking for a leaf scar or twig or bud arrangements, or looking at the bark. So now let's talk about that leaf arrangement, because this is really key. And definitely all the categories of the trees are broken down into opposite, whorled, or alternate. And I'm going to start with opposite over here. So this is just a bare twig. And you can see it's not only it's the buds, the twigs, and the leaves that are opposite. And they're basically like if you drew a line, they would be completely lined with each other. Or if you sliced this branch down the middle and folded it over, they would match up perfectly, or they would be symmetrical. And down here, just to enforce that, we have the opposite leaves, and there's also opposite buds right here at the base. And the whorled leaves, they're kind of the same. Like if you drew a straight line through here and here, they would be the same, but there's the key to opposite versus whorled is that opposite always works in pairs of leaves, and whorled is more than one pair of leaves. But they do go around the leaf, and each one would have a bud at the bottom here. And you can see these leaf scars, because that is where the leaves were attached last year. This is where they would be attached. But alternate is asymmetrical. So you can see that if you folded this over, cut it down the middle, they wouldn't line up. So it's a series of each buds are not in pairs. They're individuals that are separated on the stem. And so this is the alternate arrangement again, right down here with leaves. And you can see the little buds in here too. And now I'm going to just take a few minutes to talk about leaf anatomy. You're never going to see this leaf in the wild because it's a composite of a whole bunch of different leaves. So it's attached to the stem. The petiole can sometimes be important in identification. Stipules can be too. Those are little extra leaves. And this is, of course, a bud. It's called an axillary bud when it's on the stem. Glands can also be an important identifier. And as we're working up here, leaves are also broken into lobed and non-lobed, or two other categories that the leaves are broken into. So this is a lobed leaf. It has these distinct pieces. The indent is called a sinus. The lamina is the part in between the leaf veins. This is the midrib and the veins that are coming off of it. This pattern is used to identify leaves. And then there's a whole series of words that are used to identify the margin or the edges of leaves. So this is called entire. It's basically smooth. Anything that says serrate, lacinate, or dentate has to do with teeth. So think of teeth when you see those words, and we've got these little jagged teeth. They could have blunter ends or not. This undulate margin is just a wavy margin. Like as it gets, when it gets closer to pointed, you might call it a blunt tooth, but you can also just call this a wavy margin. And here's another, I just included this, don't worry about all these words, but they're basically entire is the same as smooth again, finely toothed or tooth, serrate, dentate is also another word, and crenate, sort of like those blunt teeth. And incised, it looks like, so incisors are also teeth. And sinuses are these big, deep indentations in the leaf as well. And leaves, to make it even more complicated as you go along, there's the simple leaf is a single leaf. You can see the axillary bud here. So, but there's also something called a compound leaf. So this gets a little more complicated, and to determine whether or not it's compound, you want to look at the bud that's at the bottom here. So this portion is called a leaflet. But one of the confusing things about leaflets that you want to make sure that you're looking at is that they can, the leaflets can be opposite on an alternate plant. Are you able to see the slides?
Yep.
And then so then to make it further, here we have our simple and our pinnately compound. Pinnate is a word you're going to see a lot, and it means like a feather. So you can see there's this mid vein that's bigger with smaller veins coming off in a very organized way. But you can also have leaflets with leaflets. So, you know, if you think of this, leaflet would have like another compound leaf. So again, you have to be careful to look down at the base and make sure that this, whether this is a twig with leaves or if it's a bipinnately compound leaf or a bifeathered leaf. And then the other category are palmately compounds. So you just want to think of that as looking like a fan. And those are the different styles that you might see. Here's some more leaf shapes. You don't need to know all these words. They're helpful if you're using different guides, and a lot of them are the more scientific words for the shapes, but like a deltoid shape, obviously this is a triangle. You can have a heart shape. Oval shapes we refer to as egg-shaped or ovate, and various other descriptors. Sometimes it's easier to separate the tree into tips and bases. The bases is where the stem is attached. And this can be really important because when you're identifying, there's several trees that most leaves are symmetrical, but some leaves are not. Like this, like the elm, for instance, it's an asymmetrical base at the leaf, and that's a really important identifier. Anyway, the next thing we're going to look at again are the venations, or the patterns of the veins in the leaf. So I'm going to start off with palmate. This is a sycamore maple, and you see there's a midrib vein, but there's also other major veins. So palmate, if you think of the palm of your hand, you can sort of think of these major veins as fingers, and then there's a whole network of secondary veins inside this leaf. Pinnate, again, it looks like a feather. There's a distinct midrib, and all the ribs branch off of that midrib. There's the secondary ribs, and this is a black birch. Another type of ribbing is called dichotomous. So it doesn't have a midrib, it just has a whole series of really close together placed ribs that are branching off in sort of a palmate style. And the final one that you see, you most often see this in trees that don't live in this area, like bananas and palm trees. But you can also see this pattern of like these sort of these two lines at the back of the eastern hemlock, which is one of our conifers. Okay, so twigs and buds and leaf scars, they're essential for winter identification. And that's one of the hard things, like once the trees drop their leaves, you really have to look at the buds. And you can see that there's a huge differences in textures and colors and shapes of various leaves. And this is a leaf scar down here, and we'll go into more detail about those. And I'm going to give you a quick tour of bud structure. So buds are either end buds or terminal buds, and they have scales that mostly, sometimes they don't have scales, but the scale protects the vegetative part of the bud. These are called lateral buds, these little ones on the side. And here's the leaf scar. So this was where the leaf was connected last year. And inside the leaf scar are the bundle scars. And these are these little dots. This is where nutrients were exchanged from the leaf to the rest of the tree. And another cool thing that you can see too are the scars. These are terminal scale scars. They're left by terminal bud scales. And you can actually look at a twig. And so this is 1 year's growth from here to here. And then this next scar shows the second year's growth and so on. And then this is sort of like a 1 year shoot, but then you can sort of see how old the tree is also, to some extent. Twig, leaves, and bundle scars, they really make a difference. At first glance, you can see a lot of these buds look pretty similar until you look more closely. There's a circular leaf scar here, a shield-shaped one here, a U-shaped one, and then the pattern of the bundle scars is very different. So, and especially this one too, you can see this one is sort of a heart shape, and it has they all have very distinct patterns. And this is a scar that entirely surrounds the bud. So we look at whether they're alternate or opposite, because the buds and leaf scars are going to be in the same position as the leaves. And so that tells you the arrangement. And the bundle scars number and pattern can be used to make a closer identification, to key out the identification. And here's just a few more examples of leaf scars and bundle scars and the variety that you will see. And these are all maple buds. They're all very unique, and they can be identified by shape, size, colors, scale number again, locations, styles, which we're going to get into in just a minute, and textures. They can be hairy or smooth or hard or soft. And so this is our example. We have, these are all buds that are at the terminus or the end of twigs. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is one that has what's called a false terminal or end bud. And it's called a false end bud because there's a leaf scar here. True end buds do not have a leaf scar. They're sort of on their own, and this sort of cants over to the side. This is the big tooth aspen. And this is a really important identifier. So it's like easy to look at the leaf tips, and the end buds are usually the big and showy buds. So we look at those a lot, and you want to look and see if there's a leaf scar there to determine what it is. So here are the three basic types of scales, three basic types of bud styles, and these are all true end buds. So some of them are imbricate. It looks like fish scales. They can be different numbers, or some have pointy or more rounded ends, and that's how you can help to make some difficult distinctions between different trees. There's the valvate or duckbill, and Eric told me too, he looks at this as like praying hands, so it looks kind of like a bud. Like this is like you'll see in the tulip tree or the striped maple. And some are called naked, which have no scale coverings. So if you look really closely at this, you can almost see the embryonic leaf right here. I don't know if you can see my cursor. So it's like sort of dusty and yellow, but this is a bitternut hickory. And that's also another really important identification. And then the number or clusters of buds make a difference. So I'm going to point you over here to the white oak. This is actually, the end bud is actually clustered. You can actually see it almost better in this picture. And this is a sugar maple. So you might glance at this and say, oh, that's a clustered end bud too, but these are actually axillary buds. So in the drawing, they're kind of lightly drawn in, but then if you see, you can see in the picture where it changes color, that's where the leaf scar is. So that's how you know that those are not end buds or part of the end bud. And you also might see clusters, not on end buds, but on axillary buds. And this is one example of that, and is another important identifier are these clusters of buds on red maple where the flowers are going to emerge. And so I just wanted to show you again the variety. These are all hickories, members of the, and they're all, the twigs look very similar, but the buds are what really make the difference. So again, here's our bitternut, the naked bud. The pignut is actually a scaled bud. It has 2 scales, but they drop off during the winter. And then the shagbark, which has this big sort of shaggy bract over the bud. And so that's the main way to tell those 3 trees apart. And maple buds too are very different. You can see all the different colors and shapes, and you can see how they could be really important identifiers of the tree. So the next thing we're going to talk about are flowers. Most trees have very inconspicuous or flowers that they're very small and they're high up and they fall off early, and that's like the red maple. The tree just looks like it has a haze of red. And catkins are also flowers. So these are important identifiers. They stay on through the winter. So they haven't emerged yet. And once they're in bloom, they sort of turn yellowish green. There's a really magnificent catkins on the eastern cottonwood. And this is a pussy willow. So you can see catkins that look like that. But then there's true flowers on things like the tulip tree. These are really showy and huge. They're high up in the tree. And when they fall off, they leave this brown husk. So in the wintertime, you can instantly identify a tulip tree when you see those. And then this is another type of flower. The actual flower is here, but these are white bracts. And so the flowering dogwoods, these white bracts that are actually modified leaves, will last for quite a while when it's blooming in the spring. And seeds and nuts are another thing, from winged samaras. These are 2 different types. They're like little helicopters. We have nuts that shagbark hickory is a smooth capsule, whereas the Ulrich chestnut has this really thorny capsule. And here's the cotton in the cottonwood. It's incredible in the spring. You'll be walking around. There's a few days where it's snowing these capsules, and they're just everywhere. This is just a single one really close up. And acorns, of course, with oaks, pine cones, and seed pods. There are quite a few trees that have seed pods that hang on the tree and drop seeds later in the year. Apple fruit is something that's familiar to everyone. It's a type of fruit called a palm. And drupes, they're usually not as luscious and delicious and fleshy as the cherries that are grown commercially, but there's a lot of different trees that have drupes. There's the flowering dogwood has this really strange looking cluster of fruit, and multiple fruits like the mulberry, they'll hang in 3s, and true berries on the American hollyberry. These last through the winter too. Birds, they're important bird food in the spring, but they're inedible to the birds in the fall, so they last through the winter. And then these seed clusters that are really unique. They have little achenes, again, these parachutes inside. They'll slowly degrade over the winter. And now I'm going to turn it over to Eric, because he's going to talk about how to differentiate bark characteristics.
Thank you, Teresa. So bark characteristics differ among species, and they differ among the individual trees' maturity. For a quick instance, you can see the big difference between pines. Right here, we have a white pine on the left and a red pine on the right. The white pine on the left is a very dark, rigid, and furrowed bark compared to the red pine, which has kind of like these scaly red plates of bark running up the side of it. So just within the family of pines, you can have very different bark.
Sorry about that, Eric.
And bark, Oh, no, it's fine. Bark textures and bark types differ among species. Here are a few examples of what types of textures that you might see. You might see some smooth bark, similar to this American beech right here. It's mostly smooth to the touch. It might be a little rough. It's not going to be perfectly smooth, like it's like a laminate or something like that, but it's mostly smooth compared to what other barks you might see. A furrowed bark, what it means by furrowed is that it has these recessed ridges. So these ridges pop out, and then there's burrows in between those, furrows, you could say. And that is something you might see on a white ash. And then you also have other barks like exfoliating bark that you would see on an American sycamore, where it almost looks like a smooth bark, but then you have like kind of like these mottled colors and scaled bark that's kind of flaking off of it. That's what you would call like an exfoliating bark. And then similar to exfoliating bark, you have barks that peel, like the paper birch. These peel in like horizontal lines, and you can actually get big pieces of these bark to peel off all in one section. You could also have somewhat shaggy bark that kind of peels off into strips, like you see on a shagbark hickory. And they could be into strips, or they could be in these long, big plates. And this is a very strong characteristic for IDing the shagbark hickory. Then you can have a little bit smaller plates or strips, you could say, but they could be more like chips, or like a burnt potato chip that kind of looks like it's going to flake off. This is a really rough bark on a black cherry. And if you walked up to that and like kind of rubbed your hand up and down, that would scratch your hand a decent amount, but they'd also kind of chip off and flake away. Just waiting for the next slide. So like I was saying, as the trees mature, the bark will change as well. So on a young sugar maple, you'll have a smooth bark to start off with, but as it grows and matures, it starts to develop like these plated furrows that you could say. So that it kind of looks like a big, like pretty like hard plates that develop along going up the tree. And those will start to develop as the tree grows. It starts off smooth, but then it starts to develop grooves and develop these plates, and they start to separate over time. The same thing goes for the cottonwood. It starts off mostly smooth, but then you get these rough, what we call lenticels. These are diamond-shaped lenticels, which is kind of where air and gases can be exchanged to the atmosphere to the plant tissue. And that's kind of like a rough bark when you walk up and touch it, but you can kind of see where these lines that are running up it, that's like the beginning of where the furrows are going to take place. And as the tree starts to get older, it starts to really pronounce those furrows and ridges. And as you can see in the bottom picture, it almost looks like it's starting to become blocky, but those ridges are so pronounced and rigid that it starts to become more furrowed and ridged rather than an exfoliated or smooth bark. And then on an adolescent red pine, it starts off kind of rough and exfoliated and kind of flaky, but then as it grows, those flakes kind of grow bigger into these bigger, blockier plates, and then they kind of get scales on themselves as well, but then they develop ridges in between them, and it kind of gets furrowed in between those as well. And our next slide will be birches. Yep. So bark characteristics change as they mature as well, but birches, they all look kind of similar as they start to grow as saplings and seedlings. They all kind of have a shiny, reddish, copperish, brown bark, and they all have these visible lenticels that are horizontal. Again, those are just pores that develop on the bark for the bark to exchange gases to the atmosphere. But then each one of these, like the yellow birch, it starts to develop those lenticels a little bit more rough, and then it starts to peel thin lines of bark kind of near those lenticels, and it starts to get a little bit more yellow and a little bit more shiny compared to the other ones. If you go down to the black birch, it starts off as more of a gray to it is brownish gray, and it's got a shine to it. But instead of peeling, it starts to develop more of a plate. And it still has the lenticels on this plate, but as it grows, these plates start to get bigger and bigger, and then those plates can break into smaller pieces and get ridges in between those plates. And then on the paper birch, similar to the yellow birch, it starts to peel, but those peels can be a lot bigger. They're not as thin as the yellow birch. They can be a lot larger and peel almost as big as you can get them. And then there's still remaining bark underneath those peels. But if you do take too much off, it could harm the tree. Tree shapes and growth formation could also be a strong characteristic to identify a tree. For tree shapes and growth formation, those mostly rely on perfect conditions for a tree to grow in without anything impeding on its growth formation. But these are some of the shapes that you might see in a full growth or a full grown tree. So for instance, an American elm in a full growth, like perfect conditioned habitat, it grows into like a somewhat vase shaped. And for the white ash, it kind of has more of a pyramid shape. And for sugar maples, it's kind of more of like an egg shape. But if you saw these trees in the woods, they might take a completely different shape, and they might be a little bit more gnarly depending on their habitat. Like I was saying, tree location and habitat has a lot to do with not only the tree form, but also identifying the tree. So if you're in a swamp, you'd likely see some red maples, some poison sumac, some black ash, or some elm. But if you're trying to find a maple that you weren't sure about if it was a sugar or a red, take a look at where you are. If you're in a swamp, you're likely to see a red maple in a swamp compared to a sugar maple that might be a little bit more upland. And then in rocky terrains, you might see hickories and black birches compared to other things. Yep. Oh. All right. Yep. We'll move on from there. You'll just find species in different habitats rather than like wetlands compared to uplands. And you take a look around and you might be able to have a better idea of what trees you would find in those habitats. So using a dichotomous tree key, it's pretty much a process of elimination of yes or no questions. So you start off, for instance, this picture says small leaves reduced to needles or scales, and it's yes or no. These are all kind of in Latin names, but the scientific term for gymnosperm, it's mostly saying needle-like or scale-like leaves, and angiosperm, which are mostly broadleaf leaves. And the dichotomous key is pretty much going, all right, does the tree have this? Yes. Move on to this step. Does the tree have this? Yes or no? Move on to this step or go to this step. And that's pretty much the way that the dichotomous tree key works. It's just a series of questions of processing of elimination to get you your answer of what your tree is. So Envirothon trees with needle-like leaves, this is our first step of the dichotomous key where it asks you, is it a needle-like or scale-like leaf, or is it a broadleaf? So we're going to start off with needle-like or scale-like leaves. So this consists of conifers or softwoods. So the trees for the Envirothon that you guys are going to want to know are pines, which consist of white pine, red pine, and pitch pine, and then eastern hemlock, balsam fir, and white spruce. These trees are evergreens, which means that they keep their leaves throughout the year, and so in the summer or winter, they'll look the same. So what's actually funny about these trees is the branching pattern isn't as important on needle-like or scale-like leaves as it is for broadleaf trees. It's more important about what the leaves and needles are distinctively. So for spruce trees, the leaves, the needles are in a square shape. So if you cut the needle in half and you look down it, the needle will be in a square. So for fir trees, those are mostly flat. The needles are mostly flat and the branches are mostly in flat splays. And for pines, the needles are grouped into fascicles. So the needles will all be in some sort of group. So it'd be like 2 needles or 3 needles or 5 needles. And the fascicles are pretty much per node. So it's pretty much like where the buds would be. And the type of fruit that they bear is called the cone. So each one of these has a cone. They're not all called pine cones, which a lot of people like to just say, oh, it's a pine cone. But hemlocks have hemlock cones, and fir have fir cones, and spruce have spruce cones. The bark and the tree form can also be an important factor, as well as the location of the tree. We're going to start off with white pine, which is Pinus strobus is the binomial Latin name. And a quick way to identify a white pine is if you get one of those fascicles and you count the number of needles, a eastern white pine will have 5 needles per fascicle. And a quick way to remember that is there's 5 needles on a white pine, there's 5 letters in white. So that's just one quick way that I've become able to identify white pine very quickly. If you want to go further than that, the needles are long, slender. They're 2 to 4 inches long. The cones are longer than they are wide, so they're much longer than other cones that you might see. And there's no thorns on them. They're hard. They're a woody structure, and so they're hard to grab onto. But there's no thorns that are going to spike you when you grab onto them. And when the trees are young, the bark is mostly smooth. But as it grows and develops, it starts to become more furrowed, rough, and rigid. Just waiting for the slide. There we go. So red pine, Pinus resinosa. One way that I learned these when I was going to school is a lot of people tried to do the letters, there's 3 letters in red, but that's not true. There's actually, there's 3 letters in red, but there's only 2 needles per fascicle on red pine. So one way that one of my colleagues taught me was just red ed. For some reason, red ed always stuck out to her, and so that's the way that we were taught. So red ed, it's a red pine if it has 2 needles. Ed has 2 letters, so 2 needles per fascicle is a red pine. Furthermore, the needles are 3 to 8 inches long. They're long and slender, but the cones, compared to the red pine, they're short and stout. They're about 1.5 to 2.5 inches long, and they're still like a woody structure, so they're kind of hard, but they have no spines on them, so they're not going to poke you when you grab onto them. And then again, the bark on a red pine, like I said before, it starts off young with like a flaky exfoliating bark, but as it grows, it starts to develop more blocky, scaly plates, and those become rigid and have furrows in between them. Moving on from there, we have the pitch pine, which the pitch pine actually has 3 needles per fascicle. These needles are a little bit shorter. They're 2 to 5 inches long. But the different thing about these cones compared to the other 2 is these ones have thorns or spines on the ends of their scales. So if you were to grab onto these cones, they'll poke you and it would probably hurt. Another strong characteristic of pitch pine is their bark. They have a rigid and deep furrowed bark, and it's in the name Pinus rigida. The bark is if you went up to try and grab that piece of bark, it would be pretty strongly attached to that bark. It wouldn't just flake off. You'd have a hard time peeling that off. And another way to look at it is the tree form is often very gnarled. It looks gnarly in appearance. The eastern hemlock, Tsuga canadensis, so these ones are very different from the pines. So these have flat, short needles. The twigs and the needles are in flat splays, they just kind of splay out flat. And the needles are about 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch long. And the cones are actually soft. So they're still like a woody structure, but they're not as stiff and firm like a pine cone would be. They're much tinier, and you can kind of brittle them apart in your fingers. The bark is kind of similar to pines, but it's furrowed, scaly, and it's rigid, and it starts to form plates much like the red pine. And a good way to identify eastern hemlock is the 2 white parallel lines underneath the needles on the bottom side of the needle. And the needles are also attached by these tiny little bracts at the base of them. So if you were to rub the needles off, you would have all these kind of spines on the twig still. So the twig would be rough. Moving on to balsam fir. So firs also have flat needles and twigs as well. So they kind of go off in a flat direction as well. They can be rounded, but if you were to press down on them, they would flatten out. They have short, flat, 3/8 to 3/4 of an inch long needle, they're stalkless. Unlike the hemlock that has a tiny little bract at the bottom, these don't. They're just attached straight to the twig. So if you broke these off, it'd be a little bit smoother than a hemlock would be. To go along with this, a balsam fir is a very popular Christmas tree. So you guys would be able to recognize the aroma of this tree very easily. It has a citrus pine smell to it, a Christmas tree smell to it. And a cool thing about this tree is it actually has blisters on its bark. The bark is mostly smooth with some rough lenticels on it. Oh, can you go back a slide?
Sure.
So the bark actually has like kind of these rough lenticels, but then it has these blisters on there that you can actually pop with your finger, and those contain pitch that also have that very strong Christmas tree citrus pine aroma to them. But a very cool thing about fir trees is that their cones actually point upwards compared to all the other ones that point downwards. So if you see a tree that has cones that are pointing upwards, that's for sure a fir tree. And on balsam fir, when the fir cones are young, they're a purplish reddish blue, and they really stand out. They're a very cool color. But as they grow in maturity, they start to brown, and they get a little bit softer and flakier, and you can kind of break them apart easily. Moving on to spruces, I believe. Yep, here we go. So white spruce, Picea glauca, the needles are actually a lot stiffer. They're a lot sharper. So if you walked up to a spruce tree and tried to grab it, that would poke you, and it would hurt your hand. They're very pokey and spiny and scratchy. So one way that I learned when I was in the Forest Service, where there was a lot of spruce and a lot of fir, and we had very young trees, you would walk up and touch it. If you touched it and it was kind of fluffy, it was a fir. But if you walked up and it was spiny, it was a spruce. That was one way that we were taught to learn. So the needles are square, stiff, and sharp, and they're usually like a blue-green in color. And the twigs are rough when the needles are removed, much like a hemlock. They have these little bracts at the bottom. So if you removed the needles and rubbed your hand down there, it would be all scratchy. The cones are also soft. They're not as hard as like a pine cone would be, but they're all pointing downward, much like the pine cones do, but not the fir trees. The fir trees go up. But similar to the fir tree, they also have a strong aroma, but it's not as pleasant as the fir trees. This is more like a smell that you don't want to smell, and it's similar to cat urine. Some people say that. Some people like the smell. It just depends on if you like the smell, really. But the bark is thin and scaly, and it just starts to flake off, and it kind of forms these circular, not plates, but circular scales on the bark as it grows. And now we're moving on to broadleaf trees with opposite leaves, and Teresa will take over from here.
Thanks, Eric. So again, the broadleaf trees, we've talked a lot about their characteristics, and we're going to start off the way the dichotomous key is set up in the Peterson's Field Guide. They're broken into opposite and alternate leaves. So we're going to start with the opposite branching and patterns. And can you see the slide yet? I think it's, we have a mnemonic device that we use. It's madcap horse. So
yeah, we see it.
See this. Okay.
Yeah, we do.
Oh, good. Okay, so so the madcap horse, there's fewer opposite trees in general. So we have maple, ash, and dogwood. So that's the mad part. And cap is caprifoliaceae, which is usually shrubs and vines. So you don't need to worry about that. But there's also the horse chestnut. That's the horse part. So you guys really have to remember mad horse, I guess, is what we're really talking about here. And so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the, these are your Envirothon trees in this slide. So the first category is going to be simple leaves. So that's that single leaf attached to the twig. And the last two trees are going to have compound leaves. And if you look in your guide, you will see that the dichotomous key is split into those two categories. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the first tree. just wait to make sure you guys can see it. It's the flowering dogwood, Cornus Florida. This is a really nice little tree. It was the example that I used for the flowers. They're beautiful flowering native trees. And this has a close-up of the real flower. Is actually this little teeny tiny yellow 4-petaled thing inside. And it's in 4 bracts, which again are modified leaves. In the winter, the leaves themselves are smooth and wavy. They're relative on the small side, 2 to 5 inches long. So they have a very pointy end, but can you see how the edge is sort of wavy? And it's kind of, it's not in pairs. The veins aren't in pairs, but they branch out from the midrib. And they're very strong. Like, this is one of the things we do in the field. I don't know if you can see those tiny lines, that you can, if you're not sure if it's a dogwood, you can break the leaf and pull it, and the veins will pull out that way. And as far as I know, it's the only tree that does that. In the fall, you can identify it by the fruit, which is this red cluster. I think this was already also one of the examples. And the bark is it's very small. These are like about 1/2 inch to 1 inch, these little plates, and they're deeply indented. So it's described by some people as a checkerboard. And the flowers and the buds and twigs, they're brown, but they're very unique buds for the flowers. They're sort of these onion-shaped flower buds, whereas the leaf buds are almost completely surrounded by a leaf scar, and they're kind of off-sided, with this soft sort of dog claw-like shape that you see in those buds, axillary buds. So next, we have 4 maples. These trees have a lot of similarities. We've shown you some examples before. So we're going to start off with the red maple, Acer rubrum. So I hope you guys can see this now. The leaves are, you can see the opposite pattern of the leaves right here. See how they're in pairs this way and this way. And the leaf is, it has 3 to 5 lobes. So these are the lobes, 1, 2, 3. And it has a finely toothed edge. So if you look closely, you can see it has these little teeth. So this really differentiates it from our other 2 maples that we're looking at. The flowers are these red, sort of tiny flowers that are high up in the tree. And their samaras are unique compared to some of the other trees too. They're almost like the angle is very small between them, maybe like 10 or 15 degrees. So they're almost like right next to each other, and they point down. They do turn this beautiful red in the fall. Again, the buds, the twigs are reddish, especially on the tips. And you want to look for those clusters of buds that's where the flowers are going to emerge. The bark, this is a really huge mature tree. It's kind of like long, rough strips when it's as it gets older. But if you look up, even in the oldest trees, the young branches will be smooth, and so you can identify it that way in the winter. And another thing that you can do with the buds, if you compare them to sugar maple buds, these are soft and round. Like if you put your finger on that, it would feel round, and it would kind of give beneath your finger. And now I'm going to move on to our next tree, the sugar maple. And I'll just wait a couple seconds to make sure you guys can see it. And when you look at the leaf now, even though they have that maple shape, it's a very different leaf. It lacks those tooth serrations. It has big teeth though, and it has up to, it can have like 5 to 7 lobes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it will, it can vary in the number of lobes that it will have. It has that palmate venation like the other one. So it's, but it is very different from the red maple when you see the leaves. The flowers are also different. They're long stalked like the red maple, but they're yellow and they emerge later. The samaras are also different. There's a larger angle here. That's a really good way. If they have fruit on them, you can look at them and see that it's, the samaras are, that's probably more like, I don't know, 50 degrees or so. But they're at an angle. They're at an angle to each other, but it's not as acute as the angle on the red maple. And the buds are similar. It's more brownish than reddish, the twigs and buds, but they're similar, but they're very pointy. There's more scales, and it's actually hard to the touch. It feels sharp. If you put your finger on top of this, it would. It's pretty hard. Like you'll feel it stick, it kind of sticks and it doesn't give to your skin. And it's a little bit different from the red maple. It's sort of has these deep furrows, and it's rough. It's semi-platy, you know, but it's kind of bumpy within there too. It's more bumpy. And even the young trees appear smooth, but if you run your finger across it, you'll feel little bumps in there. And actually, it's funny, we mark trees with crayons and they make a sound. I know that doesn't help you guys that much, but it's funny, like you can't really see it so much, but you can feel it, the little texture that's in the sugar maple leaf. And our next tree, oops, I went a little bit too far, is the Norway maple. This is an introduced tree. It was planted as a specimen. If you see a maple tree that's really tall and it has dark burgundy leaves, that's a variety of Norway maple. It's very pretty, but the problem with this tree is that it is an invasive species. And it's also, it just shades out understory plants so they can't grow. And that's another way you can tell. If you're walking down the street, you'll see it as a street tree because it's very tough. It can survive rough conditions. And you'll often see that even the grass is having trouble growing beneath it because the shade is so dense. But you can see this 5 to 7 U-shaped lobes, and it's a palmate leaf. It's a lot like the sugar maple. It's really hard to look at them and tell them apart. In general, though, it's a little bit broader across the base than the sugar maple is, but it has a couple of other identifying characteristics. If you pick the leaf off and squeeze it, it will exude this milky sap. And if you do that with the sugar maple, it will be clear. It'll be clear sap. And it also gets this fungal disease that just looks terrible but doesn't really harm the tree, called maple tar spot. So sugar maples don't get that. If you see a leaf in the shape with those tar spots, then you know it's a Norway maple. The flowers are also a little bit different. They're upright. They grow in upright clusters, and they're yellowish. And the samara is almost in a straight line. I don't know if you could see the difference, but this is a giveaway. And they tend to start dropping off the tree earlier in the spring, whereas sugars and red maples will hold on to their samaras later and drop them closer to the fall. But you'll see these dropping through the spring and summer, and they're almost a straight line to each other. And also in the winter, to identify in the winter, the buds are really different. They're huge. They're a lot larger. I think they're 3/16 of an inch. And they look like turbans. They have fewer bud scales than the sugar maple, but they're kind of bulgy. They can be greenish to this purple color. So their color is different, a lot different. And then, of course, the bark has these shallow ridges. From a distance, it almost looks like cantaloupe skin. I always think of it as looking like cantaloupe skin. So you don't get those big kind of irregular strips that you see on the sugar and red maple. You get these furrows, and they're kind of, they have kind of a pattern to them. They look stripy. And then our last maple is really different from the other ones. I'm going to just give it a few minutes to load, but it's called the striped maple. And it's a small tree. Those other 3 trees are big trees. They grow to be big shade trees. But this is a small, tops out about 15 feet, understory tree. And it has very beautiful bark. It's named for the bark. So I hope you guys can see it now. It's striped green and red. Even here in Central Mass, it's a little, where we live, it likes cooler temperatures. So you'll see it as you go further north or at higher elevations, you'll see it more often. There's some beautiful ones. If you hike the Wachusett Mountain Trail, they're right along, I think it's Jack Frost Trail that you're going through. And the trees there, they're gorgeous. It's not just the green, which is most common, but they have red and yellow. The bark is really smooth, even on the mature trees, and it keeps these beautiful stripes. And again, the goosefoot name, one of its names, you can see how different this leaf is. So it has 3 lobes that are sharply pointed and has very fine serrations. And the leaf texture, the laminate, this portion in between the leaf, it's very crinkly on this tree. And they're large, it's understory. So usually the more shade, the larger leaves will get. And the flowers they're a little bit bigger, but they're still on a long panicle. And here are the samaras later in the year. They look a lot like sugar maple samaras, but the rest of the tree is very different. And then in the winter, if you're looking at the trees, they're mostly green. The twigs are mostly green if you're trying to make a winter identification. But the buds are like really distinctive. They're this bright pinky red, and they have this kind of, it almost looks like white dust on top of it. But they're very unique looking. You can see this looks like the duckbill or the hand spraying, and it is this bright red color. So they're very distinctive. And now we're going to move to another category, and this has to do with compound leaves. And the tree that we're going to look at here, the first tree we're going to look at is a compound leaf, and it's the white ash. So one of the sad things about ash is you'll see them looking pretty sick if you go out into the field to identify them. They're being attacked by an invasive insect called the emerald ash borer. So you'll see the bark is shallow and in ridges, sort of flattened. You know, they come to thin points, but they're slightly flattened. And here's our compound leaf. So if you look closely, you can see the difference between the twig and the leaf. And here's another leaf coming off here. So you can definitely see that it's opposite. And it's called a feather compound leaf, and it's pinnately veined. And you have 5 to 7 leaflets. This weird thing about this tree is that even though it's in the compound leaf category, but the leaflets can actually be smooth, or they might have some teeth on them too. They could be like finely toothed. So there is some variation of this tree in that way. The flowers are wind pollinated. They open very early. They're pretty nondescript, and the samaras are unique looking. And sometimes these will persist through the winter. You'll see them hanging in clusters. It's something that happens when the ash is not feeling very well. And there are these helicopters that kind of whirl, and they're dispersed by the wind. And the twigs are pretty distinctive. They look kind of knuckly almost. Like when we're teaching people, you'll see them. They'll be branched off like this. And so if you imagine two other twigs coming out of here, they almost look like scary Halloween hands. They're these thick, gnarly looking fingers. And the bud on top is also very distinctive. This end bud is, it's not a cluster again. These are axillary buds. You can see the scar there. It almost looks like a Hershey's kiss. So it's it's an easy to see tree out in the woods. It's pretty common. Unfortunately, a lot of them are standing dead right now. And it has very unique U-shaped leaf scars. And inside here are bundle scars. They're sort of in a smile. Our next tree is also has a compound leaf, and it's our last opposite tree, and it's the horse chestnut. And it's this is a tree that people buy because of its beautiful flowers and interesting leaves mostly. So it's an ornamental, and you're mostly going to see this in parks and graveyards and in people's yards. So this leaf is the compound leaf. Here's the stem is attached here, and this is the leaflet. It's a fan shape. It's unique in fan-shaped leaves in that if you fold it, the tip to the base, it is asymmetrical. So it's kind of more rounded on the end, more pointy at the attachment point of the leaflet. And the buds are also very striking. They're huge. They're 1/2 an inch, which is really huge. So they just really jump out at you. You don't usually see buds that big, and they're shiny and they're very sticky. If you touch them, it really sticks. Like you've got to kind of use soap to get it all off. And the fruit is in a capsule. It's very thorny as opposed to spiny. So it's thorny, so they're not quite as densely covered. And it has one large nut. In the fall, when they drop, they dry and the husks open up. The bark is also kind of scaly and chippy, but you probably won't even go that far to do the identification. And if you're looking at the twigs, this is a very unique shape. It's a sort of a shield shape, and then the bundle scars make a U shape inside the shield. So now we're going to move on to our next category, which is broadleaf trees with alternate leaves. So again, these are hardwoods. And I hope you guys can see this slide. I have your Envirothon trees. So on this slide, oh, thank you, Eric. So on this slide, I broke the trees down, or we broke the trees down into toothed simple leaves. So all of these trees in this box have a simple leaf, which is one leaf. So we have toothed leaves. They can be hard, you know, like they're important identifiers, but there's a lot of these trees that have toothed leaves. And then there's smooth edged, or what they will call entire, like the tupelo or black gum. And then there's lobed trees. Here we have these four, well, there's these two trees, and then we have four oaks, I'm sorry. And then the multiple leaf sassafras, which is kind of unique. And then there's compound leaves again. So these are they're going to have leaves with leaflets. And this is sort of how your book breaks down. It calls the smooth, though non-toothed trees, but they're really smooth. So I'm going to move on to the first three trees in this category. They're all in the genus is Populus, and they're pretty similar. So I'm going to just kind of point out the differences once you're there to find them. So the first one is the quaking aspen, and the leaf here, it has a flattened petiole, so that's that stem at the end of the leaf, and it is also a darker green on the top than the bottom, and it's kind of heart-shaped with a fine-toothed margin. And this leaf is, it's really aerodynamic. I actually read a paper recently. There's a person who is using the aerodynamic design of this leaf to try to make a more efficient wind turbine, because like they're very distinctive. In the slightest breeze, all the leaves will be flashing. You see them flash because they're flipping from side to side, and you can see the underside of the leaf as well. They also have really beautiful bark, and when they're young, it's smooth and shiny. So actually, it's smooth and kind of matte colored, and you can see the little lenticels in there. And Eric talked about this type of tree bark too. So here are the lenticels deepening into ridges as it gets more mature, and it gets big platy blocks at the bottom when it gets really old. And the bud shapes are similar. It's a false bud. This is the example that we had when I was talking about the false terminal bud early on. Its flower is a catkin. So these are kind of poofy. This looks like a pussy willow. And it makes these little fruit capsules, and the little individual seeds will fly out of those and spread around. These trees are really good at colonizing areas that have been disturbed. So you'll find them at the edge of projects like sand pits or building sites. They fly long distances and they grow really fast. And our next tree in that category is closely related. It's the big tooth aspen, and you can see the name is, the species name is grandidentata. So again, big teeth right there. And you can see this leaf is, the teeth are they're much coarser and deeper. It's kind of more of an egg-shaped versus a heart shape. And you can sort of see the flattened petiole here and here. They're flat instead of rounded. Most trees attach in a flat base. And this shows the contrast between the front and the back of the leaf. Again, the bark is white and with dark lenticels when it's young, and it gets more platy and darker gray as it gets older. This has also a catkin. It looks a little bit different from the aspen catkin, and it has a longer sort of fruiting capsules. They also have little fluffy seeds that float really far. One way that you can tell the buds from the other is that they have this sort of dusty sort of covering. It's called a glabrous leaf. It looks like it's been lightly dusted with flour. So they have this sort of dusty brown look to them. And then the final tree in the Populus family is the Eastern Cottonwood. So this is a pretty magnificent tree. Its leaves they're triangular, and you can see they're kind of indented here in the base, and they have blunt teeth, but it's and they have that flattened petiole. You can really see it on this. So you want to look closely at the leaves. Actually, we're putting together a little dichotomous key based on this slideshow that is not completed yet, but Britta tells us that she can posted afterwards, so you'll have something you can bring out into the field, and in that there'll be pictures that show these leaves next to each other, so you can also help differentiate them. So they have similar twigs with these really shiny, slightly sticky, really large end buds. They are like false terminal buds again. And the bark starts out, it's not as white as the other trees usually. It's kind of a light yellowish, like green, but it has a matte shape to it. It has a little diamond-shaped lenticels, but it quickly matures to these deeply ridged, strong gray plates. And this will go up the trunk pretty far, like some of both the quaking aspen and the big tooth aspen. They don't tend to bark up as quickly as this. There's none of the white bark left at the bottom very shortly. It has these pretty exuberant catkins. And then here's the seed capsules, the cotton, and it just spreads like crazy. It's just like you can really, really see it. And it's just like it's snowing when you're out on a spring morning or a spring day and the wind is blowing. One of the most unique things about their stems or the sticks is that they grow these little wings, and not every stem or sapling is like that, but it looks almost rectangular, but it's a dead giveaway that if you see these kind of ridges and wings, that it's easier to see it in 3D. I wish we could do that, but it almost looks like it's rectangular, the stem itself, and that's a very strong indication that what you're looking at is an eastern cottonwood. So our next tree is American beech, and it's another one of those single tooth leaf trees. So this is an egg-shaped leaf. It has a very pointed tip. It's longer than it is wide, and it has a tooth margin. You can sort of, it's kind of intermediately or coarsely toothed, but they're very pointy on the edges. And it has a shiny, waxy, smooth surface, so it's very smooth to the touch. And the bark is also really smooth. This is a really distinctive tree in the woods. And I hope you will go out and look for trees in the woods. And if you're looking this time of the year, one of the dead giveaways that you've got a beech is this little tree. The big trees drop their leaves, but these little trees, and you can really get a good look at the end tips, the bud tips on the end, they hold on to their leaves all winter, so it's kind of like a beacon in the woods. Like you can see it almost driving by, but don't do it on your own. Have a friend who's looking for the beech and don't drive distracted. But you can peer into the woods and see these very easily. And it's one of the few trees that does this. Like oak will hold on to their leaves, but they're very different. And you can see the structure of the leaf, and they turn this nice light color, so they look really bright in the woods. And the scales, the buds themselves are really elongated. They look really different from all the other buds we've seen so far. They have scales with little points, but they're long and skinny. They look very elegant. They have these long, skinny twigs. And the flowers are pretty inconspicuous and yellow, but they have this really neat-looking fruit. The husk, for some reason, these are called spiny bracts, and they're thorny on the outside. And but you can tell for sure that what you're looking at is a beech nut if you open it up, and there's two triangular seeds that will lie flat against each other. And so here's another tree that used to totally dominate the forestscape, the American chestnut. It's a tree that's in trouble, but it also has a very distinctive leaf. It's a very long leaf, at least 6 inches long, and it has these deep, coarse tooth margins. So it's kind of leathery. So it almost has a texture to it, pretty distinctive. The buds, if you're walking through the woods in the winter, they're kind of a golden brown with some lenticels, and there's only like about 3 scales on here. They're really tiny, teeny tiny buds, but they have kind of a gold color. It's kind of a golden brown. You'll see them, they're mostly like shrubs. Sadly, there's something called the chestnut blight that killed almost all the American chestnuts. And so when you're in the woods, you'll see these circles. This is what the blight does. It like blisters the bark so the tree can't transport nutrients, and it dies back to the roots, but then the roots will shoot up again. So you don't often see the mature bark, which is kind of smooth with then these deep rivulets. You mostly see the young bark, which is this shiny kind of gray and grayish green with little teeny tan lenticels in it. And you'll definitely see this like sort of circle usually around them. Although there are efforts being made to look for resistant trees, occasionally you'll see a bigger one in the woods. It's always a shock and a treat to run into one. But there are also, there are people who are making hybrids that are resistant, with the Asian chestnut that are resistant to the blight. Again, their flower is a catkin. They're kind of, you know, they in really heavy duty bunches, and they have this spiny husk on the fruit, so it actually hurts. Like it's pretty sharp, but you'll know for sure that it's a chestnut if you open it up. It has 3 little nutlets in it, and it will crack along the seams and open up like that as the season goes on. Another tree in this category that's on your list is the American elm, and this has doubly dentate leaves. You can see in its pinnate venation. But the most distinguishing characteristic of this tree is that it has this uneven base. So it's not symmetrical. There's varying degrees of it being not symmetrical. So with all of these trees, I would recommend really strongly that you look at more than one leaf on each specimen, because there's changes. There's some variety, so it's good to look at many to make sure. And if you folded it over, you can see the bottom wouldn't line up, and so that's how you can tell that it's asymmetrical. The bark is really distinct. It has this sort of shaggy bark. When you push on it, it's spongy, and it has these little ridges that are. It's easy to crack off a little piece if you want to really be sure that it's an elm that you're looking at, and it has these layers. It looks almost like an Oreo cookie or an ice cream sandwich. So it's alternating layers of dark and light, and it's pretty cool. And it's like definite. If you have some doubt, you can just take off a little piece, and you know, once you see that pattern, you know that you have an American elm. So it has a false terminal bud. It's pretty small, and the twigs are pretty fine and delicate, and they have that glabrous, dusty brown color. The axial buds tend to lean in. They're on stems, but they lean in close to they have stalks, but they lean in close to the stems. The flowers are pretty hard to see. It blooms early, high up in the tree. And they also have samaras. These are like little ones. They're less than half an inch, and the seed is kind of in the center. You can see each one is backlit. You can see the seed in here. So they're like little helicopters, just like the other samaras that we've looked at. And here's the American basswood, which is another pretty grand native tree. So hopefully you guys can see this. The leaves are heart-shaped, so they're pretty distinctive compared to most of the other leaves we've looked at. The indentation in the base is pretty deep, and they have those fine-toothed edges and this pointed edge. And there's this fruiting part that's really unique to the basswood too. So these are what the flowers look like, and you can see that even as the fruit is forming, the flowers are forming, they have this little, basically wing that's attached to it. And these are called nutlets. The fruit is called nutlets, these little things on the end. So they will stay on the tree through the winter and then blow off in the spring. So they're very distinctive. Nothing else has fruit that looks like that. Another thing that can really catch your eye when you're trying to identify the American basswood twig is this, the stem turns bright red in the winter. And you can see here it's green, this stem that the leaves are attached to. So the new growth is green in the summer, but it turns red, bright red in the winter. And I love the buds on these. It's a false terminal bud, but it only has 3 scales. So these 2 on the top, and there's this big one in there. It's bulbous, like the middle section really blebs out. And I've read that they're edible, but I guess they're kind of like mucusy and they taste awful, but you can eat them. And when I ever look at this, I always think that it looks like a mouse in a helmet, and Eric will say it looks like a shark's head. So you can just use whichever one of those that you like. The bark can be smooth when it's young. It almost looks like sugar maple, but of course this is an alternate tree. So if you see this, you can be confused by this, but double check those buds and make sure they're alternate. And it has very deep ridges and furrows in the bark. Okay, and these are the last two trees in this category, and I'm going to turn it over to Eric. And I'm not sure what the best order to do this in, because he's going to talk to you about birches, which are also in this category of toothed simple leaves. And these types of trees, the first one I'm looking at, it's got two cherries, the choke cherry and the black cherry. And they can be confused, especially the young bark can be confused with birches, as can the leaves sort of. So you want to look really carefully at these. Like birches and these two trees like each other, they've got a twig that's kind of slender, and it's got that dusty, glabrous, kind of cloudy look to it. And it has multiple scales in the tip of the end bark. The leaf itself is more egg-shaped as opposed to long and skinny, which is the black cherry. And this is, it's not hairy on the back of the midrib. And if you're not sure and you've got two branches that you think are cherry, you can actually count the midrib, the vein pairs. So here's the midrib, and then these are the vein pairs. So this will have 8 to 11. Again, we'll put together that so you can refer to it. We'll put together that little dichotomous key. The bark is different on these. As it matures, the choke cherry bark tends to peel like a lot of beeches, but it reveals like this sort of brown underneath, and it doesn't peel as much as the birches peel at all, but it has this kind of brownish bark. The underbark is tan, orangey tan. The fruit is drupes. These are like cherries. The drupes are long, and they're they kind of get this blackish red, and the flowers are in long clusters or racemes. So, and one of the most important indicators that what you have is a cherry is that it has a bad odor. I've had people describe it as bitter almond. It just smells bad to me. It's just like a foul smell, and I don't know how to describe it, but it does stink. And when you smell it, it's like, oof, gosh, that's definitely a stinking cherry. Although the fruit is really good. And so again, I'm just going to show you the twigs, and the buds look very similar. They're covered with lenticels. They're light brown. They can have a little bit of glabrous spots in them. We have the same flowers, long racemes, and the fruit looks very similar, except that when the black cherry fruit ripens, it's very black. It's like this very dark. It doesn't have the reddish tint left. It just turns black, but that disappears really quickly. It's important bird food. But the leaves, you can, when you're comparing them side by side, this is much longer and skinnier, but also the top of the black cherry leaf is not, it's waxy and shinier than the leaf of the choke cherry. And the teeth are blunter and they're incurved, whereas the choke cherry leaves are much sharper. And the bark, the young bark, is shiny and dark with grayish and brown light stripes, the lenticels again. There is a difference in the mature bark. Like this gets to be a really big tree. The choke cherry is a shorter tree. It tops out about 20 feet, but black cherry can get very tall. And it has these like chippy looking bark. Like to me, it looks like it's burnt potato chips. But now we're going to move on. I don't know if you can see the slide yet, but Eric is going to take over, and he's going to start with the birches.
So starting off with gray birch. So Betulia populifolia. Populifolia because it's similar leaves to poplars, as you can tell in that photo right in the center. It has a very similar leaf to the aspens, but it doesn't have that flat petiole, so it won't be flapping in the wind. But one thing I want to point out is that it still has the triangular shape to it, but it has a long sort of what I want to call snout to it. And one way that a quick trick for me to identify gray birch has a very similar bark to paper birch, but their leaves are very different. So this leaf reminds me of like the face of an elephant. And so when I see this type of leaf and I'm looking at a birch or a gray birch or a paper birch, I'm not sure, If I look at this and I see that shape, that reminds me of an elephant, I think elephants are gray, so this must be a gray birch. So that's a quick way for me to identify gray birches if the leaves are present. Another way to, a characteristic to differentiate the barks of a gray birch compared to a paper birch is they have like these black, what we call chevrons or mustaches, which are like these curved lines that go over the branch scars. And the paper birch don't have that, but the gray birch do. So that's a strong characteristic to differentiate the two. They also have catkins as their flowers, but they have a single catkin. They don't have multiple. Their buds are scaled and their twigs are rough and warty with like lenticels, and they almost look like they have some sort of plume on there, but they're actually hairless. Just wait for the next slide, that's all. So moving on to white paper birch, Betulia peperifera, it's paper, resembles paper. They also have catkins, so it's 2 to 3 catkins usually. And their leaves are much different from the gray birch. Like I was saying, they're more oval, they're still toothed, but they have a slight point at the end, not like a long snout like the gray birch does. They're still pinnate, but they have slightly hairy texture to them. If you were to rub them in between your hands, it's like slightly furry, you could say. The buds are also have scales, but they're hairless as well. But they have like 3 or more scales on them, and the twigs are slightly slender. And like I was saying before, the bark is completely different from the other birches because it starts to peel in these long strips horizontally. And it starts off like a reddish copper color, but then it starts to develop into this white color. And it still possesses these lenticels that grow horizontally on them. And this tree is actually historically used great for fire starting because the bark, these peels actually contain a lot of oil that's flammable, and it's good for a fire starter. Oh, here we go. Black sweet birch. So Betula lenta, it's lenta because they wanted to really tell you that this has lenticels, but it's also called sweet birch. The reason why it's called sweet birch is it is the most popular birch used for birch beer. It also has a sweet wintergreen taste and smell to it. So if you were to walk up to this tree and kind of confuse it with a cherry, and you were to break a twig off and smell that twig, this will smell pleasant and wintergreen. It'll smell nice. If you were to break off a cherry twig and smell it, it would have a very strong, bad odor. It wouldn't be pleasant. So that's like one way to differentiate the two if you're in the field. So these also have catkins, 2+ catkins. One thing I forgot to mention in the other slides is that the female catkins, the flowers, they look a little bit different in the springtime. They'll grow straight up. They almost look like hops, but they're catkins. There's just the female catkin compared to the male catkin. The leaves are more egg-shaped, but they're more oval. They're longer. They're not as egg-shaped as the paper birch. They're still toothed, and they're hairless leaves, so there's no texture to them on their surface. And the bark on black birches is very different from the other birches because it doesn't peel. Like I was saying in the bark slides before, it starts to develop more of these big plates that start to break off of one another, and big fissures kind of form in between those. But then it still has those lenticels causing a roughness on those plates. And these buds also have multiple scales, and the bud scars kind of stack up onto one another. And that's a good way to tell the black birch. So yellow birch has a slightly different leaf. It's still toothed, and it's slightly longer. It's similar to the black birch, and it's still hairless, just like the black birch as well. Has 2 catkins usually. It can have 1. And the buds are slightly hairy. So these are the ones that have slight hair on the buds, and they still have scales as well. And they kind of look warty, but those are just lenticels along the twigs. And these, just like the sweet birch, the black birch, these are the second most used birch tree for that wintergreen scent and taste. So if you're going to go to have birch beer, sometimes they would use yellow birch to make that as well. And just like the other birches, they start off kind of like this copperish brown color with the lenticels still present, but then it starts to develop more like a golden yellow or a grayish yellow color. And then the strips that peel off are much thinner than a paper birch would be. And then it starts to become quite like shiny. If it's in the sunlight, you'll be able to see this kind of matted shine to it that it has. And we can move on from there. That's good. So moving on from there, we are moving on to Tupelo, black gum. But the difference between these and the ones before is these are entire margins. So these don't have teeth on the edges of their leaves. And they're more of like a leathery texture as well. They're egg-shaped, and they have the pinnate venation going. The twigs and buds are brown to reddish-brown, and the twigs still have some lenticels on there. Their leaf scars have a U-shaped leaf scar. In the bundle scars, there's usually 3 individual dots in that leaf scar, which are the bundle scars. The flowers are greenish yellow, and they come in clusters. And then also the fruit come in clusters as well. They're drupes, and they ripen in the fall. And there's usually 1 seed per each one of those drupes. And then what they look like in the summertime is more of like a greenish color, but then they ripen into like a blue purplish color in the fall. But their bark is deeply checkered. It's similar to the flowering dogwood, but these blocks are a little bit longer and a little bit deeper than a little bit less neat than the dogwood is. And we'll move on from there to the American sycamore. So these are, we're actually moving on to lobed simple leaves that are alternately formed. American sycamore, Platanus occidentalis. So these leaves are fairly large. They can be 6 inches to 10 inches long. And they have 3 to 5 lobes that are slightly toothed. They're not wavy, but they are slightly toothed. I think it's undulate. I'm not sure of the terms. But they actually have a very unique thing with their stipule. Their stipules actually kind of encircle the twigs about where the leaf comes out from. And this kind of is like a saucer around that area. And it's where the leaves actually come out. And those stipules cover up the buds and the bud scars. So the stalk base is actually hollow covering the bud. So if you broke off the leaf, the bud would kind of be encapsulated by that pretty much. It has 1 hairless bud, and it has 1 bud scale. The fruits are small and hairy. They kind of are a tight, long, or a tight brown ball that's attached by a long stalk that hangs from the branches. And they kind of they resemble their flowers, but the flowers are actually just a small, like globus, almost like a dandelion, but it's a little bit more firm than a dandelion. But then they start to the flowers pollinate into the air, and then the fruits start to firm, and they're a little bit more solid than what the flower looks like. The bark is, like I was saying before, it has the peeling exfoliated bark that has more of like a bone white color to it, and then it has like a mottled green and brown colors that come out from underneath those flaking off brown scales. There's a similar tree out there called the London plane tree that has similar markings to it, but it has a lot more yellows in it rather than white. Moving on from there is the American holly, which the cool thing about this tree is it's actually it's not deciduous. It doesn't drop its leaves in the winter. So in the wintertime, you'll still see these leaves persisting. They're kind of like a leathery texture to them, and they're oblong, and they have kind of like a wedged end towards the stem of the leaf. And they have these lobes that come out that kind of have these prickers on the ends of them. So if you were to grab onto those, they'll kind of prick you, but they're not that strong that they'll actually like stab you maybe. But they're about 2 to 4 inches long. And they also possess red berries. They can sometimes be yellow. It just depends on if they're like a cultivar or something like that. But these are usually found as like hedgerows or shrubby. They don't always make it to their full tree form because a lot of people use them as ornamental trees in their yards. They also have small white flowers that are almost translucent. They kind of look shiny as if they're almost sticky, but they're actually not sticky. They just kind of look like that. And then the bark is a very smooth bark. It's gray with these white and green blemishes, similar to what you'd see on like a young maple. But with the leaves on there, you'll tell the difference right away between any other tree, because no other tree has leaves that really look like this, and the leaves persist throughout the winter. Moving on to oaks. So these are, I want to say feather-like lobed. So what I mean by that is they're not pinnately lobed, but if you were to fold that in half, they'd be symmetrical to one another. So black oak are 4 to 10 inches long, and they're kind of thicker in the lamina. The actual leaf itself is thicker than other oaks. It's kind of glossy on top, and it's not as lobed as the other ones. Like the lobes don't come so close together. The sinuses don't come so close to the midrib. They're actually just moderately lobed, and they have bristle tips. And what I mean by that is they have these kind of sharp tips on the ends of the lobes, and this is indicative of a red oak species. So black oak fall underneath a red oak family. So there's white oaks and then there's red oaks, and black oak fall underneath that. And a difference between a black oak and a red oak, because they look very similar, is that there will be hair on the underside of a black oak along the veins in the midrib. Their twigs are hairless though, and their end buds are usually like a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, and they're densely hairy and gray, and they have sort of like a sharp angle to them compared to the white oak that's more of like a blunted or rounded bud. The black oak acorns, their shells are actually like finely and like gray hairy, but they have this like rough edge that has like these scales that kind of flake off of them. And they don't cover the entire acorn, but they cover almost half of it. So a way to identify oaks is not only by the leaves and the twigs, but also by the acorns. The acorns also have a strong characteristic for identifying them, and they change in size, and the shells change in shape as well. The bark on a black oak is usually dark and blocky, and it has these shiny ridges, like the blocks will have sort of a sheen to them if the sun catches them right. Just waiting for this. And I don't know if I mentioned it before, these are clustered buds. Their true end buds are all in clusters. White oak, Quercus alba. So the differences between a white oak and a red oak family is the white oak have these kind of rounded tips instead of those bristle tips that have the points on the ends of them. So white oak has 2 inch to 9 inch evenly lobed and hairless leaves with these rounded tips. And they also have somewhat of like a wedge-shaped base towards the end of them. So they're not as wide. They kind of come like to a quick edge at the bottom of them. Their twigs are hairless, and their end buds are small and red, brown, and blunt and hairless, compared to the red oaks that are mostly like sharply pointed if you were to put your hand on there. These are more rounded, and it'd be a little bit softer on your hand. It wouldn't scratch against your hand. The acorns on the white oak, they are, the cups themselves are bumpy, and they cover maybe 1/3 of the acorn or less. And the acorns themselves look a little bit larger than the shell themselves. Yeah. The bark is a whitish and slightly furrowed bark, and it starts to get a little bit scaly on those ridges of the furrows as well. Scarlet oak. So this is also a red oak, but the difference between these leaves is that it's deeply lobed. So those sinuses go deeply towards the midrib. They're still U-shaped, but they go much closer to the center of the midrib. They're 3 to 6 inches long, and they still have those bristle tips. So it's in the red oak family. And they can have tufts on like the underside along the midrib and the veins, but it's a little bit different looking than the black oak. So you'll be able to tell the differences just between the lobes of the black oak and the scarlet oak. Their twigs are hairless, and their end buds are scraggly and like they got like scraggly hairs on them. It's almost like a pubescence on there, and they're also blunt. They're not sharp. The acorns are the caps to the acorns are brown and hairless. They don't have like any hair or anything like that. They're kind of smooth, but they still have somewhat scales on them, and they cover roughly half to a third of the acorn itself. And the bark is actually much different than the other ones. It's dark, and these are finely grooved furrows. So it's not as blocky as the other oaks. These ones are a little bit closer together, and it looks more similar to maybe like a Norway maple bark rather than an oak bark. And then finally, northern red oak. So this is like the main red oak that you want to focus on. So these are 4 to 10 inch lobed, hairless and thin leaves, and they're dull. They're not shiny and glossy like the black oak, but they also have those bristle tips. All red oaks have those bristle tips. They're not rounded. The white oaks have the rounded tips. The acorn cup is much different than the other ones. It barely covers any of the acorn itself. It's more of like a top hat or a saucer like on top of it, and it's also hairless. The bark is much different from the other ones, well, it's similar to some of them, but it becomes more like these big blocks, and it's furrowed blocks that often become shiny on top of those ridges. And it kind of looks like the ridges kind of got flattened down. So it's not rough on top of those ridges. It's more flat on those ridges. And these end buds are usually sharp. They're not angled, but they're sharper. They're not blunt like a white oak would be, or a scarlet oak. And the buds are 3/16 of an inch to 5/16 of an inch. So they're pretty tiny, but they're all still in that cluster of buds. Moving on from the oaks, we have a very unique tree. It's called the sassafras, Sassafras albineum. What's unique about this tree is that it can have 3 leaf patterns all on the same tree. So it can have, in the left-hand side of the center photo, it could have 1 lobe, which makes it look like a mitt with 1 thumb, or it could have a entire simple leaf just with no lobes, or it could have a leaf that kind of looks like a dinosaur footprint that has 2 lobes. So this can happen all on the same tree. So if you're looking around and you see these 3 different types of leaves on the tree, you're likely to have a sassafras. But one great way to figure out if you have a sassafras, which is my favorite part of this tree, is that the crushed leaves, the bark, and the twigs all have this very distinct aroma that's very pleasant. It's kind of like a lemony, spicy smell, and I've had people it's also kind of got like a fruity smell to it. Some people relate it to a bowl of Fruit Loops. I've heard various other things that it's compared to the scent, but it's a very pleasant smell. And sometimes in the past, a lot of people would make tea or root beer out of sassafras, but they found that there's carcinogens within the plant that could be harmful to humans. So they stopped producing that, and they started using a substitute for sassafras instead, called sarsaparilla. So another cool thing about this tree is that the twigs are green. and sometimes with like a dusty plume on them. But it's the twigs and the young trees, the saplings, will all have like a green bark to them. So if you went outside right now and you found a small sassafras tree, it would be mostly green. And where it was more mature, it would start to develop a brown and yellow kind of rough bark towards the base of the tree. And as the tree develops, it actually develops a very deeply furrowed bark, which kind of resembles like a cottonwood, you could say. But one way to, if you're confused, if you have a cottonwood or a sassafras and the twigs are so up high that you can't get a twig to see or smell, you can actually take a knife or something like that and scrape some of the bark. The bark underneath will have a very red hue to it. So that's one way to tell sassafras between sassafras and cottonwood, if you were confused between the two. They bear fruits that are blue, fleshy drupe or berry that come out in clusters. And same thing with the flowers. They come out in clusters, and they're like a greenish yellow flower that's very small. The buds and the bud scars, the buds are rounded and yellowish and green, but they have this purplish outline for their scales. They have multiple scales, but a strong characteristic for these is within the leaf scar, there's only one horizontal bundle scar. So compared to other ones that have multiple buds or bundle scars, this one has one bud scar per leaf scar. It's a little confusing there, but we got through. Moving on from simple leaves that are lobed, we're moving on to compound leaves that are alternately branched or alternate formations. So shagbark or all hickories are compound leaves. We're going to start off with shagbark. So these are 5 to 7 finely toothed leaflets on one leaf. One compound leaf has 5 to 7 finely toothed leaflets. And then the bark is very distinctive bark compared to other trees. It has these long, shaggy, loose strips that kind of go up the tree vertically that you can kind of like pull them off and they'd all strip off vertically. Their nuts are in capsules and they're 1 to 2 inch in size, and they have these thick husks that actually split into 4 down the base. In the young nuts, they kind of look like almost like a pumpkin almost, but as they develop, they start to brown and get harder and they split. So when they hit the ground, the nut is exposed out of the husk, and it makes it easier for the seed to germinate. The buds have overlapping scales, but these actually hold on to a long bract that stays with the bud, and that's a good way to be able to identify winter ID for hickories, is this long bract stays with these terminal buds compared to what we're going to look at next, which is the pig nut. It might be the bitter nut. It's the bitter nut. All right. So bitter nut hickory. These also have capsulized fruits that contain their nuts, but they're a little bit more cylindrical, and they have ridges that go outwards rather than inwards like the shagbark hickory. Kind of makes it look like a pumpkin, but this kind of goes outwards with their ridges. And the husk are a bit more thinner compared to the thick husk of the shagbark hickory. And the bark is much, much different than the shagbark hickory. This is a tight, fine, smooth furrows. You can walk up and kind of run your hand down. It's not that rough. And you can kind of see how tightly those grooves are together. Another thing is these have 5 to 11 leaflets rather than 5 to 7. So there's much more leaflets on these leaves. And they're somewhat hairy underneath, but they're still toothed just like the other hickories. But the biggest difference between this hickory is the naked bud that they have. So these lack scales, and as you can see, it has the early leaf forming. Pretty much, you can kind of see that there's leaves forming there. And then no other hickory has a naked bud. And then now moving on to the pignut hickory. Really quick, we'll go over to the buds on the right. They have the overlapping scales, and their twigs are much more slender than the shagbark hickory, but they also lack that bract that surrounds them, that large bract that surrounds the terminal bud. So that's the easy way to tell the difference between the shagbark hickory and the pignut hickory. Oh, you got to go back a slide. Oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. So the nuts are much different in shape. They're more of like a pear shape, and they have like a ridge that goes on the outside, much like the bitternut hickory does. But these are completely different in shape compared to the shagbark hickory. They also have a very thin husk as well. The bark is similar to the bitternut hickory, but it's much rougher. These furrows are a little bit more spread out. The ridges are a little bit more spread out. And on top of those ridges is rough. Compared to the bitternut hickory, it's a little bit more smooth. And much like the shagbark hickory, these have 5 to 7 hairless leaflets that are still finely toothed. And then from there, we are moving on to walnuts, which also have a compound leaf, and they are alternate, formed onto the alternately branched. But the big thing about these are they have these large spherical capsulized nuts. They are almost like a perfect ball. They have a very thick husk on them. And a crazy thing about these is that walnuts contain this adaptation called allelopathy, which means it has some sort of chemicals within it that make other things have a hard time to survive around it. It's also carcinogenic. So these husks to these black walnut, they used to be used to stun fish and to kind of have like a mass fishing operation. They used to crush up all these husks, throw them into the water, and the chemicals in that husk would stun the fish. That's illegal nowadays, but it was just something that they were able to use. But it's just an example of how harmful these the chemicals are in the allelopathy. You'll also notice that not a lot of things will be able to grow around walnuts because it's also within the roots, and you won't have any understory around them either. A strong identifying characteristic for both white walnut and black walnut is that the twigs have a chambered pith. So in the twigs, like the center, the core of the twig is hollow. So if you cut that open, there would be a little hollow spot in the center of it. So in black walnut, it's pretty large, but it's lighter in color. And in white walnut, it's actually darker in color. But it's funny because the wood from the trunk, the main wood of the black walnut is black in color, and the color of the wood in a white walnut is white in color. Another strong identifying characteristic is actually these leaf scars. These leaf scars, they have bundle scars in groups of 3, but it actually shapes almost like a face. A lot of people say it looks like a monkey face or an alien face, like it has 2 eyes and a mouth. That's indicative of both walnuts. But the difference between the 2 walnuts is this one doesn't have any hair at the top of its head. So if you imagine like the 2 eyes and the mouth, the black walnut is hairless. The white walnut, I'll go over in a second, it has little tufts of hair, almost like an eyebrow or something like that on top of the face. Walnuts also possess catkins as their flowers. And then another strong identifier between the black walnut and the white walnut is the not the number of leaflets, but the absence of the end leaflet on the compound leaf. So there's 7 to 17 toothed narrow leaflets that are slightly hairy underneath, but on the black walnut, that last, like the terminal leaf will be missing. But on the white walnut, it'll be present. And then also the twigs are like whitish and they have woolly buds. They're naked buds that kind of look like they have some hair on them. And it's kind of got this like white glabrous look to it. So moving on to butternut, also known as white walnut in the woodworking industry, they have oblong and sticky husk compared to the spherical husk on a black walnut. These are longer egg-shaped ones. And they sometimes can have ridges along on the edges as well. So there's a big difference between the two nuts as well. The bark is slightly similar to the black walnut. It's furrowed and it's densely furrowed, but on top of those ridges, it's very flat. It almost looks like somebody took a black walnut and took an iron and just kind of ironed out the tops of those ridges. So it looks very flat on top, and it can also be shiny in some cases if the light's hitting it right. And then again, those leaflets, that end leaflet is present on a white walnut. It's not present on a black walnut. It's got very similar looking buds. It still have like the kind of woolly-ish looking buds, but the twigs are less glabrous as well. They don't have any hair on there. It still has the chambered pith, but like I said, it's much darker than the black walnut, which is ironic because the black walnut has black wood and the white walnut has white wood. But like I was saying before, with these leaf scars, there's a prominent hairy fringe on top of the bundle scar. So there's a prominent hairline on the face of the monkey or the alien. So you'll be able to see those two eyes on the sides and then the U-shaped bundle scar on the bottom. So that's one way to identify white walnut versus black walnut. And they still possess catkins as well as their flowers. And I believe that's it.
That's it? Are there any questions?
That was a lot of information to take in.
Yes.
So yeah, feel free to email us if you have any questions, if you think of it later.
That was epic.
Yeah.
Thanks, you guys. All right. So I can
There's questions
let
in the chat.
people, if you want to either raise your hand, I can let you talk, or you can type questions in the question and answer. We have one, a shout out appreciation from Tabitha Hawkins in Salem about doing these. So thank you. I'm not sure you're still here, Tabitha, but glad that you're enjoying these webinars. They're useful. And we just looks like a few people just left. If you want to ask these two a question while they're here to answer it, we can do that right now, or you can send them an email later. I don't want to rush us off or distract people from typing. So I'm trying to be patient. That wait time is hard for me. But at any rate, I think we're good. So I am just going to say a tremendously huge thank you from Envirothon to Eric and Teresa. Thank you so much for all of that amazingness. And I will post a video of this and the handout you were talking about earlier with the dichotomous key. When you send that to me, we'll have a link so that folks can use it in the field. So thanks so much for help getting our teams ready.
And thank you to everybody for just sitting through this very long presentation. And
Yeah,
please
thank you
do
for sitting
contact us
through
with
this very long.
questions. We'd love to hear from you. We can help you solve any ID problems that you have. We'd love to help. So
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Take care.
Thank you,
Have a great night, everybody.
Happy holidays, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.